For 15 long years, the only voice Ruby Lane ever heard was her own, a low hum that drifted across the dry wind of the Arizona plains. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Her world stretched 100 acres wide, a patch of stubborn earth, guarded by the towering Dragoon Mountains. The cabin her father once built stood firm against the desert's cruelty, a lonely outpost that had outlasted fever storms and time itself. Solitude wasn't just her life, it had become her armor. But on one blistering Tuesday in August, that stillness shattered. 7 dark silhouettes crested the ridge cutting through the haze. They weren't drifters or miners. They were Apache, proud, silent, and unyielding. And they hadn't come for water or war. They had come for her. The sun hung merciless above Ruby's homestead, hammering down on the cracked soil. At 22, her face already carried the map of hard-seasoned sun-browned skin eyes, the pale blue of a high desert morning, and hands calloused by years of work. She moved with the sharp precision of someone who'd long since learned that mistakes meant hunger or death. The rhythm of her axe striking wood was the only heartbeat in that endless wilderness. Her father, Hank Dobbs, had taught her everything before the fever took him and Mary Beth. How to read a storm before it came, how to shoot straight, how to never rely on another soul. Her little valley was hidden and defensible, blessed with a spring that ran all year, a treasure in land this dry. That water kept her small garden alive, her 2 mules watered and her chickens fed. The cabin was rough but solid pine logs sealed with clay and stone. One window faced east to greet the sunrise. One ironwood beam barred the door each night. It wasn't comfort she lived in, it was survival. The ghosts of her parents lingered faintly worn thin by silence. Ruby stacked the last of her firewood and brushed the sweat from her brow. Something felt wrong. The birds had gone quiet, even the air seemed to wait. Her hand slipped instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker on her hip, the same pistol her father once carried. She scanned the western ridge, her eyes steady, her body tense. The desert shimmered under the heat, and then through the wavering light they appeared. 7 riders on painted ponies moving like shadows born of the earth itself. Broad-shouldered, tall, and silent, they rode in perfect formation, sunlight glinting off their rifles. Ruby's breath caught. They were Chiricahua Apache, long black hair, bound with leather skin glistening in the sun, strength carved into every line of their bodies. They didn't shout, didn't threaten. Their silence was heavier than gunfire. She stood her ground. Panic was a thing Hank Dobbs never allowed. Her boots rooted in her soil, her pistol steady in her hand, she watched them descend the slope. 7 giants on horseback, quiet as falling dusk. They stopped 50 yards from her cabin. The one in the center dismounted. He was massive, built like a mountain with eyes black as obsidian and cheekbones sharp as the granite cliffs behind him. A single eagle feather hung in his dark hair. He passed his reins to the man beside him and started toward her, slow, deliberate, unarmed. His palms were open, empty, his steps calm. Ruby cocked the hammer of her pistol, click. The sound cracked through the air like thunder. "That's far enough," she said, her voice rough but steady. The man stopped. His gaze met hers, steady, unreadable. No fear, no surprise, just patience. "I've got no quarrel with you," Ruby called. "Say what you came for and move along. The spring's mine." It was always the same reason strangers came water, but the big man's eyes wandered past her, taking in the cabin, the garden, the stacks of wood, the life she'd built from nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep measured and carried the faint rhythm of another world. "We did not come for water," he said. His tone was calm, his English deliberate. "We did not come for war." Ruby kept her pistol trained on him. "Then what in God's name did you come for?" The man, his name she would soon learn, was Tay. Let the silence linger. The 6 warriors behind him sat motionless, a wall of muscle and will. Tay took one more step forward, his eyes locked on hers, and in that still air Ruby saw something she hadn't expected. Not menace, not anger, but purpose, something deep and solemn that made her pulse jump. Whatever he had come for, it wasn't simple, and it sure as hell wasn't over. There was a weight in his voice that carried something old, something solemn, like the echo of mountains that had seen centuries pass. "My name is Tay," he said, his tone steady and deep enough to vibrate in the still air. "I am the son of a great chief. These men beside me are my brothers, my most trusted warriors." He looked her over from the frayed edge of her dusty jeans to the loose strands of sun-browned hair that framed her face. "We have traveled 3 days from the Sierra Madre," he continued quietly. "We have come to ask for your hand." The words hit Ruby Lane harder than a kick to the chest. The sun, the land, the 7 towering riders, everything blurred and tilted. The only thing real was the cold metal of the Colt clutched in her hand. Marriage. The word didn't even make sense. For a woman who hadn't spoken to another soul in years, it sounded like madness whispered through a fever dream. The silence that followed pressed down on her like the desert heat. A hawk screamed in the distance. A fly buzzed between them. Ruby's heart pounded so loud it drowned out everything else. She stared at the Apache leader's face, searching for a hint of mockery or trickery, but there was none. Only calm, unflinching resolve. "You're out of your damn mind," she finally muttered, voice low and trembling. Tay didn't flinch. His patience stretched wider than the horizon itself. "It is not madness," he said softly. "It is purpose." Purpose. Ruby snapped, her tone cutting through the still air. "You ride onto a stranger's land," and she stopped herself, shaking her head. "Get off my property. All of you. Now." She raised her gun toward the ridge where they'd come from. The 6 warriors shifted ever so slightly, one breath, one heartbeat of readiness, but none moved. Their eyes never left her. Tay stood still as a monument. "We will not leave," he said, his tone quiet but certain. "Not until you have heard our offer in full." "I've heard enough," she shot back. "I don't know what kind of joke this is, but I'm not interested. The answer's no. Now get off my land before I start shooting. I don't bluff." To make her point, Ruby turned her aim slightly and fired. The .45 cracked like thunder, scattering the stillness. A puff of dust rose just beside Tay's moccasins. He didn't so much as blink. His eyes stayed locked on hers, steady, calm, impossible to read. The McGraws behind him sat like statues, their silence more unsettling than a war cry. "You shoot straight," Tay said evenly. "But you have 5 bullets left, and there are 7 of us." His gaze softened. "We don't come to harm you, woman of the spring. We come to honor you." "Honor me?" Ruby barked out a bitter laugh. "By making me your squaw, I'd rather be buried out here." The word cut through the air, sharp and ugly. For the first time, a flicker, maybe hurt, maybe disappointment, crossed Tay's dark eyes before it vanished. "You misunderstand," he said, his voice low but firm. "A chief's wife is not a slave. She is the heart of the lodge. She is respected, protected, fed, warm, safe." He gestured to her cabin, her garden, her land carved out of loneliness. "You live alone," he said simply. "You fight for every scrap. Every sunrise is another battle. With us, you would never be alone again." The words struck deeper than she wanted to admit. He'd seen straight through her, the exhaustion, the quiet ache she'd buried under years of grit and work. But pride flared like fire. I like being alone, she lied flatly. I chose this life. No one chooses to be the last one left, Tay, replied his voice cutting through her armor. It is not a choice. It is what the world gives. But you do not have to keep it. Frustration rose in her chest, a kind she didn't know how to fight. She could handle rattlesnakes and drought and prowlers, but not this, not a man who fought her with patience. I've got nothing more to say, Ruby said, lowering the gun but keeping it close. The answer's no today, tomorrow, and forever. You stay or go, it's all the same to me. She dragged the toe of her boot through the dirt, drawing a line about 10 feet out. You cross that and I'll put a bullet in you. Then she turned, forcing her legs to move, forcing herself not to run. The cabin door slammed shut behind her. She dropped the heavy bar into place and leaned against it, shaking. She waited for the sound of hooves fading into the distance, but none came. Only the wind, the birds, and the low hum of silence. Peering through the crack in the shutter, Ruby froze. They were still there. The McGraws had dismounted and were building a quiet, orderly camp near the base of the ridge on her land, just beyond the line she'd drawn. They weren't leaving. They were settling in. They moved like men who'd done this 1,000 times before. Quiet, efficient, every motion deliberate. They fed their horses, built a smokeless fire, and settled in as if they meant to outlast the winter itself. A cold weight pressed against Ruby Lane's chest. They weren't leaving. They were besieging her solitude not with guns, but with silence. It wasn't a raid she could shoot her way out of. It was a standoff of patience, a slow war where endurance was the only weapon. They had time. They had numbers. All she had was a patch of hard land, a few rounds of ammunition, and a loneliness that suddenly felt like a living thing closing in around her. By dusk, when the blood-red sky stretched across the ridge, their campfire flickered faintly below. The McGraws were there to stay, and Ruby knew it. A crack had formed in the walls she'd built around her life, and she feared whatever poured through might drown her. 3 days dragged by. The 7 Apache remained silent, steady, impossible to ignore. They didn't come near her cabin again, holding to the invisible line she'd drawn. Their discipline was unnerving, their quiet constant. They hunted the hills at dawn, returning with deer and javelina, their work precise and wordless. The smell of smoke and rawhide drifted faintly on the breeze. They spoke little, their voices low, blending into the hum of the desert. They were waiting for what Ruby didn't know, for her to break, to starve, to surrender to the weight of their stillness. Her supplies were running out. The flour tin was light, the salt nearly gone. She'd put off the trip for weeks, but now she had no choice. Leaving her homestead unguarded felt like suicide. Staying meant going hungry. Either way, the choice bit deep. She needed to reach Redemption Gulch, and maybe just maybe find help. Though she already knew no one in that dusty town would risk themselves for her. Before dawn on the 4th day, Ruby saddled her strongest mule, Nora Callahan, the leather creaking softly beneath her hands. She packed 2 flour sacks, a small knife, and the list she'd carried in her head since spring. When the first pale streaks of morning brushed the peaks, she unbarred the door and stepped out, rifle gripped tight. The Apache camp was already awake. Tay stood near the fire, steam rising from the tin cup in his hand. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with that unreadable calm that set her nerves on edge. He made no attempt to stop her as she led Nora toward the trail that wound out of the valley, but she could feel every pair of eyes following her, quiet and measured, until she disappeared beyond the ridge. It was like walking through a corridor of judgment, each heartbeat echoing in that vast silence. The ride to Redemption Gulch took half a day. The sun climbed high, the dust thick and dry in her throat. The town finally appeared, a single sunburned street lined with weathered buildings, a saloon, a blacksmith, an assay office, the sheriff's small jail, and Evelyn Hart's mercantile, where she always traded for salt flour and gossip. To the townsfolk, Ruby Lane was that hermit girl, the one who lived out by Dragoon Pass, the one who talked to no one. She tied Nora to the hitching post and stepped inside. The bell over the door jingled a sound far too cheerful for the weight she carried. The air was cooler here, thick with the smell of coffee beans and saddle soap. Evelyn looked up from behind the counter, her kind eyes widening. "Well, I'll be. Ruby Lane." "You haven't been in for months," she said warmly. "You look worn down, dear. Everything all right out your way?" Ruby nodded stiffly. "Just need flour salt coffee and 4570 cartridges." Evelyn bustled about gathering her order. A man by the pickle barrel turned around Wade Cross, the cattle baron, who'd been buying up land all over the county. His clothes were too fine for a man who claimed to work cattle, and his smile was practiced, polished wrong. "Miss Lane," he greeted, tipping his hat voice smooth as oil. "Didn't expect to see you in town. I trust your spring's still running clear, it is," she answered shortly. Wade's eyes lingered sharp and calculating. He'd offered to buy her land more than once, and she'd turned him down every time. That spring was her lifeline, and he wanted it bad. "You know," he said, rubbing his chin, "a woman alone with something so valuable ought to be careful. Heard the Apache have been restless lately." Ruby hesitated. She'd sworn to keep her troubles to herself, but the pressure of the past days broke loose all at once. "I have a problem, Mr. Cross," she said quietly. "There are 7 of them." "Apache? Camped on my land!" Evelyn gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Wade's expression changed, his interest sharpening like a knife's edge. "On your land?" he asked smoothly. "Have they threatened you?" "No," Ruby admitted the word, tasting bitter. "They just won't leave. Their leader, he asked me to marry him." The store went dead silent. Evelyn blinked, as though she'd misheard. Wade chuckled under his breath, the sound cold. "Marry him," he repeated, grinning. "Lord, the heat must have gotten to him or to you. It's the truth." Ruby snapped, her cheeks burning. "They've been there 4 days. They won't leave." Evelyn leaned closer, voice trembling. "You need to tell Sheriff Boone. He'll take care of it." Clinging to that fragile hope, Ruby paid for her supplies, loaded them onto Nora, and marched across the street to the sheriff's office. Eli Boone, once a lawman worth his badge, now looked worn and tired. His gut strained against his shirt, his mustache drooped like an old horse's tail. He sat polishing a shotgun, barely glancing up when Ruby entered. She squared her shoulders and began to tell him everything. Eli Boone was hunched behind his desk, polishing a shotgun that had probably seen more action than he had in years. When Ruby Lane stepped inside his cramped, cluttered office, he barely looked up. She told him everything. Every impossible, maddening detail, her voice flat but steady, the sound of someone hanging on by sheer will. When she finished, Boone set the shotgun down and let out a long, lazy sigh. "So let me get this straight," he said, his tone slow and patronizing. 7 Chiricahua warriors, who far as anyone knows ought to be down in Mexico, runnin' with a Higa's band or camped on your land. They ain't stolen nothing, ain't hurt you, ain't fired a shot. They're just sitting there. And their chief, who apparently speaks fine English, asked you to marry him." Ruby's jaw tightened. "Yes," she said through gritted teeth. Boone leaned back in his chair, picking up a paper from his desk. "Huh," he muttered, pretending to read. "Funny thing, Wade Cross filed a complaint last week. Claims you've dammed up the creek flowing from your spring, says you're cutting off his water." That's a lie, Ruby snapped. My spring doesn't touch his land. He just wants what's mine. Boone tossed the paper aside and gave a half shrug. Maybe, maybe not. Either way, Miss Lane, I got drunks brawling in the saloon, prospectors stealing claims, and men like Cross burying me in paperwork. What you got sounds more like a fairy tale than a crime. There's no law against a man asking a woman to marry him, and sure as hell no law saying I gotta pick a fight with 7 Apache over where they pitch camp. So you're not gonna do anything, she asked quietly, hope dying in her voice. Boone picked up the shotgun again, rubbing it absently. Ain't nothing to do, he said, his voice dismissive. Sell your land to Cross, move somewhere safe, or learn to live with your new neighbors. Either way, it ain't my problem. Now, if you'll excuse me, Miss Lane, I got real work to tend to. Ruby stood there for a heartbeat, the air thick with disbelief and fury. She'd ridden all this way for help only to find mockery dressed up as law. Boone's badge wasn't protection. It was a shield for men like Wade Cross. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked out her back straight, her anger simmering. Outside sunlight blazed off the dusty street. Across the road on the saloon porch, Wade Cross lounged with a glass of whiskey, watching her with that smug little smile that made her skin crawl. In that instant, she knew. He'd been there before, her spinning lies poisoning the well, turning the sheriff's ear. Ruby's stomach knotted. She was alone. Truly, completely alone. The danger on her land wasn't just the silent Apache camped by her spring. It was the smiling white man in town, and a system built to serve him. She mounted Nora Callahan and rode out of Redemption Gulch with the kind of calm that comes before a storm. The road home stretched long and empty, the sun sinking low behind her. Each mile hardened her resolve. If she was going to survive this, she'd have to do it herself. The world had drawn its lines, and Ruby Lane stood firmly on one side against everyone else. By the time she reached her valley, the air was painted gold with the last light of day. A thin plume of smoke curled from the Apache camp. The sight no longer sparked fear, just a quiet acceptance. They were part of her land now, like the rocks, the wind, the endless horizon. The law had turned its back. This was her fight now. In the days that followed, life settled into a tense rhythm. Ruby went about her chores with fierce, deliberate purpose. She mended fences, tended her small garden, cleaned her rifle, and made sure every move said, "I am not afraid." But she could feel them watching the McGraws, silent as shadows. They saw her strength, the sure way she hauled water from the spring, the precision of her hands as she repaired a leather strap. The loneliness etched into every motion. And she in turn began to see them differently, not as faceless enemies, but as men. One young warrior practiced with his bow for hours, his aim flawless. Another, older with streaks of gray in his hair, sat carving small wooden figures by the fire. She caught them laughing softly now and then, a sound so unexpected it startled her. They cared for their horses with a gentleness she didn't expect from warriors. Tay had stopped speaking of marriage. His words had failed him, so he began to speak in a language Ruby understood better, the quiet kindness of the land. One morning she found a freshly killed rabbit on the flat stone by her door. Cleaned, ready for the pan. Her first thought was suspicion poison, maybe. But no, it was perfect. A gift. Her pride flared, but hunger and reason won out. Wasting good meat was a sin out here. That night she cooked it, ate in silence, the taste strange and humbling. A few days later, a storm rolled over the valley, lightning flashing, wind howling, rain pounding the earth. A heavy branch broke loose and crushed the fence near her chicken coop. Ruby grabbed her tools, but before she could lift the limb, 2 of Tay's men appeared through the downpour. They didn't speak, didn't meet her eyes. They just worked, lifting, mending, fixing the fence with swift, practiced hands. When they were done, one gave a small nod. Then they turned and walked back into the rain. Ruby stood there, soaked to the bone, staring after them. They hadn't come to conquer her world. They'd come to change it quietly, patiently, one act at a time. With quiet, wordless coordination, the two warriors braced their shoulders against the fallen branch and rolled it aside. The older one, his black hair streaked with silver, pulled a coil of sinew from a pouch at his hip. His fingers worked quickly, looping and tightening the wire with practiced precision until the fence was stronger than before. When they were done, both men gave Ruby Lane a brief, respectful nod and walked back toward the McGraws' camp without a word. Ruby stood in the rainwater streaming from her hat brim, too stunned to move. They'd helped her. Freely. 15 years had gone by without another soul lifting a hand for her. That simple act, unasked for undeserved, cracked something inside her. Gratitude mixed with suspicion, and for a long moment she didn't know which one stung worse. A week later came a moment she'd never forget. Her old mule, Luke Callahan, had wandered too far from the pasture and tangled himself deep in a thicket of mesquite. By the time Ruby found him, he was panicking, thrashing, braying, tearing at his own hide as the thorns bit deeper. She tried to calm him, whispering and tugging, but he only fought harder. Then Tay appeared out of the shadows, moving with the quiet assurance of someone who understood wild things. He didn't go straight in. Instead, he circled around the animal, his voice low and rhythmic words in the Apache tongue that rolled soft and steady like water over stone. Luke's ears flicked toward the sound. His frantic struggle slowed. Tay kept talking. As he approached, one hand raised, his movements smooth and patient. He touched the mule's neck gently, murmuring to him in that same quiet cadence. He didn't pull or force. He simply stayed beside the trembling animal, letting his calm bleed into the panic until it ebbed away. Piece by piece, he freed the branches, snapping them cleanly until Luke stood breathing hard but unharmed. Tay ran a large, calloused hand down the mule's flank, checking the scrapes, then looked up at Ruby. For the first time since she'd met him, his face softened, a flicker of warmth breaking through the stoic calm. "He's got a strong spirit," Tay said quietly, like his owner. Ruby didn't answer. Couldn't. Something inside her shifted. The walls she'd built to survive this harsh land, the suspicion, the pride, suddenly felt less like protection and more like a prison. These men weren't the monsters whispered about in Redemption Gulch. They weren't savages or raiders. They were disciplined, respectful caretakers as much as warriors. Tay hadn't just freed her mule. He'd shown her a way of living she'd never known: harmony instead of struggle, patience instead of dominance. She watched as Luke pressed his muzzle against Tay's shoulder, trusting him completely. Her eyes followed the Apache chief's profile, carved by wind and sun, lined with the weight of leadership. And she saw not an enemy, but a man offering something far different than control. It wasn't subjugation he wanted. It was partnership. That thought was still frightening foreign, but no longer absurd. That night, as Ruby tended Luke's scratches by lantern light, she caught herself softly humming an old tune her mother, Mary Beth Dobbs, used to sing. The melody rose into the quiet night like a memory of warmth she thought she'd buried for good. Her valley didn't feel so empty anymore. The silence carried a pulse, something alive, something watching. For the first time in years, her loneliness began to feel like expectation. 2 weeks had passed since the McGraws arrived. The uneasy standoff had shifted into a strange sort of balance. Ruby no longer gripped her pistol every time she stepped outside. The Apache weren't intruders. Now they'd become part of the landscape, as constant as the wind. Their gifts kept coming venison quail once, even a side of wild boar. In return, Ruby left small bundles of her garden's yield beans, squash-dried corn, on the flat stone where they left the meat. A silent trade. A fragile peace built on respect. And yet the question gnawed at her, why her? It couldn't be her looks, the desert had carved its mark on her long ago. It couldn't be her land, the Apache were people of the high country, not farmers. The mystery sat heavy on her shoulders. One evening, as the sun bled gold and crimson across the ridges, Tay approached alone. He stopped at the faded line she'd once drawn in the dirt, a mark that had come to mean far more than she ever intended. Ruby Lane. He called out his voice, steady, respectful. May I speak with you? The time has come for you to know why we came. Ruby looked up from her porch, her rifle laid across her lap. Curiosity had long replaced fear. She nodded once. Speak. Tay didn't cross the line. He stood there, tall, unarmed, backlit by the dying sun, and began his story. 16 years ago, he said slowly, my father, Chief Nakai, led a small band through these mountains. They weren't raiding. They were returning to our home in the Sierra Madre, after meeting with the Navajo. Then came the ambush, not soldiers, but bounty hunters, men from Mexico who hunted my people for coin. Ruby's pulse quickened. His words stirred something buried deep in her memory. Flashes of a child's half-forgotten past. My father was wounded, Tay continued. A bullet shattered his leg. He told his men to leave him behind, but the hunters were closing in. He crawled into a cave ready to die so his warriors could escape. Tay's eyes met hers, dark and solemn. But he wasn't alone. A white man found him. A man with hair the color of corn silk and eyes like the open sky. A man who lived in this very valley. Ruby's breath hitched. My father, she whispered. Tay nodded. Hank Dobbs. He was hunting when he heard the shots. He found my father half dead. He could have walked away, could have claimed the bounty. Instead, he saw not an Apache, but a man. He brought him here. You and your mother tended him, hid him from the bounty men who scoured these hills for days. As Tay spoke, pieces of memory flickered to life. Her mother's hushed voice, the scent of strange herbs, a wounded stranger lying in her father's bed. A man whose skin was darker than hers, whose voice carried the rhythm of drums and wind. It all came rushing back like a half-remembered dream, finally made whole. It was all true. Tay said, his voice steady, but filled with quiet reverence. For 2 weeks, your parents kept my father alive. They gave him their food, risked their lives, and hid him when the Crow gang hunted through these mountains. When he could finally stand again, your father, Hank Dobbs, gave him a mule and a pack of supplies. He showed him a secret pass through the high ridge to keep him safe. Tay took a slow step forward, his boots crossing the faint line Ruby Lane had drawn weeks ago. He wasn't coming as a threat, he came carrying the weight of the past. Before my father left, Tay continued, he swore an oath, a blood promise between 2 men. He said the house of Nakai and the house of Dobbs would never forget this debt. He told your father, when that little girl by your door becomes a woman, my son will come. He will join our families, and the life you saved will be repaid through generations. He paused, his dark eyes locked on hers. He promised that the daughter of the man who saved his life would be honored as the wife of the man who would one day lead our people. The meaning hit Ruby like a storm breaking across the desert. This wasn't madness. It wasn't conquest. It was a vow, a sacred pledge sealed 16 years ago between a frontier farmer and an Apache chief. Tay's voice softened. My father died 2 winters past. His last words to me were of his debt and his command to fulfill it. I didn't come to steal a bride, Ruby Lane. I came to repay a sacred bond, to offer you my name, my people's protection, and to bind the promise that your father forged. If you join us, this land, this spring, will be guarded by the Chiricahua forever. You will never be alone again. Ruby sank slowly onto the porch steps, her legs trembling. Everything she'd believed about her life shifted beneath her feet. Her father, the quiet man who'd taught her to hunt and read the wind, hadn't just been a survivor. He'd been a man of fierce compassion whose single act had tied his daughter's fate to an entire nation. And Tay, he wasn't a suitor. He was the son of a leader, carrying the weight of honor, closing a circle that had begun long before Ruby could even remember. The hand he offered wasn't just asking for marriage, it was asking her to join a legacy. The thought frightened her, but it also filled her chest with something new, something vast. That night, she lay awake, listening to the faint sounds of the Apache campfire in the distance. Her father's face hovered in her thoughts, not as a fading ghost, but as a man of quiet bravery. The McGraws weren't strangers anymore. They were living proof of her father's promise, a living bridge between 2 worlds. But the world beyond her valley wasn't finished with her yet. Back in Redemption Gulch, talk of the Apache bride spread faster than wildfire. Eli Boone had shrugged it off, calling it a domestic matter. But Wade Cross, always hungry for her spring, smelled opportunity. He spun his tale across the saloon painting Ruby as a helpless woman trapped by savages. Each time he told it, the story grew darker. The McGraws became raiders. Tay became a war chief holding a hostage, and Ruby became a damsel in desperate need of saving. Fear and whiskey made easy recruits. Within a night, Cross had gathered a dozen roughnecks, drifters, debt dodgers, and old Boone riders willing to trade conscience for coin. Boone, coward or accomplice, turned a blind eye. As dusk fell 2 days later, Cross and his gang rode out, guns loaded, drunk on righteousness and rot-gut whiskey. Their plan was simple. Storm the valley, kill the Apache rescue, Ruby, and then convince her to sell the land for her own safety. And if she refused, well, the desert was full of accidents. Ruby was sitting on her porch, watching the stars blink awake when she heard it, the thunder of horses. Not the light tread of Apache ponies, but the clumsy, iron-shod pounding of drunk men on big ranch stock. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her rifle, just as a sharp whistle sliced through the air from the ridge Tay's signal. The McGraws melted into the rocks, silent as ghosts' rifles ready. Tay moved fast, appearing out of the darkness, and onto her porch. Inside, he hissed. They come with anger. Who Ruby demanded knuckles white on the stock of her rifle. The man from town, Tay said grimly. Wade Cross. He comes to make war. Before she could speak again, the mob roared into the valley. Cross was at the front, his hat tipped low, his pistol gleaming under the moonlight. All right, you savages, he bellowed. Party's over! Let the woman go and we might let you live. His men fanned out behind him, shouting drunk and wild-eyed. The scene was chaos, untrained brutes against disciplined silence. The McGraws crouched low in the rocks, patient waiting. This is my land, Ruby shouted from her doorway, rifle raised. You're trespassing. Get out! Cross laughed, swaying in his saddle. Playing along with them, are you, sweetheart? Don't worry, we'll save you. He raised his revolver. Last chance, heathens. The first shot didn't come from the McGraws or from Ruby. It came from one of Cross's own men, a drunk with shaky hands. The bullet smashed into the cabin's doorframe inches from Ruby's head. That was the end of words. The night erupted in thunder gunfire, echoing through the canyon like a storm breaking over the mountains. From the ridge, the McGraws answered with chilling precision, their rifles cracking in perfect rhythm. 2 of Wade Cross's men dropped before they even had time to reload. The Apaches didn't fight like drunken cowhands, they fought like ghosts, shifting positions with every shot, turning 7 men into the illusion of 20. This wasn't a brawl, it was a hunt. From the doorway, Ruby Lane braced her rifle against her shoulder, firing into the chaos. The heavy .45-70 roared, and one of the Boone riders spun from his saddle, falling lifeless into the dirt. She worked the lever action like second-nature chamber aim fire. She wasn't just defending her home anymore. She was fighting beside those who had come to honor her. Tay stood tall in the open calm, amid the storm, directing his men with subtle gestures, his rifle speaking for him. He didn't hide. He led a chief commanding not through fear, but example. Within minutes, the fight was decided. Cross's men weren't soldiers. They were drunks with guns. The moment their courage sobered, they broke scattering back toward Redemption Gulch, leaving the dead behind them. Wade Cross's horse went down under him, and he hit the dirt hard, scrambling behind its body. His fine clothes were soaked in dust and blood, his hands shaking as he tried to reload. Then silence, heavy and absolute. Only the moan of the wounded and the restless snort of a horse broke the stillness. Ruby stepped forward, rifle hot in her hands, her heart pounding. The McGraws emerged from the rocks, silent and steady. Cross looked up and saw Ruby standing shoulder to shoulder with Tay, her eyes blazing with fury and something more dangerous certainty. He saw what he had missed all along. She wasn't a frightened woman. She was a queen, and these weren't savages. They were her guard. This land is protected, Cross, Ruby said, her voice carrying across the valley. By me, and by my future husband. The words fell like a verdict. The moment sealed her choice, made not in peace, but in the fire of battle. Tay's eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw pride burn through his stoic calm. A bond of blood and honor had been reforged in gun smoke. The moon rose slowly over the valley, silver light glinting on the bodies of the fallen. There was no cheering, no victory cry, only the quiet, grim rhythm of survival. 2 of the McGraws were wounded. Without hesitation, Ruby fetched her father's old medicine kit and tended their injuries with a steady, careful touch. The act spoke louder than any treaty, the unspoken beginning of unity. Tay handled Cross. He didn't kill him. That would have invited vengeance from the white world. Instead, he gave him the one punishment worse than death. He stripped him of his weapons and boots, leaving him 1 canteen. Walk back to your town, Tay said, his voice cold as iron. Tell your lawman what happened here. Tell him the land of Hank Dobbs is now under the protection of the Chiricahua. Any man who rides against this woman again will be treated as an enemy of our people. There will be no warning next time. Wade Cross stumbled off into the night, barefoot, and broken the serpent of Redemption Gulch defanged. By dawn, a second posse rode in, led by a reluctant Eli Boone, shamed into action by the terrified ramblings of Cross's survivors. He expected to find a massacre. Instead, he found Ruby Lane, sitting on her porch, calm as a Sunday morning, sipping coffee. Tay stood beside her, unflinching. The bodies of the fallen had been laid neatly in a line. Miss Lane Boone said, his voice tight. "Are you—" "All right. I'm just fine," Sheriff Ruby replied evenly. "Can't say the same for the men who attacked my home. My guests and I defended ourselves, nothing more." She let the word guests hang in the air. Boone understood exactly what it meant. He glanced at the scene, the quiet dignity of the Apaches, the calm strength in Ruby's eyes, and realized how wrong he'd been. The story he'd heard in town crumbled to dust. "Cross claimed you were being held hostage," Boone said weakly. Ruby raised an eyebrow. "Does this look like a hostage situation to you, Sheriff?" She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Tay. "Wade Cross is a liar and a coward. He tried to kill me for my land. These men saved my life." Boone's face sagged. He knew he'd been beaten by truth and by the quiet strength of two people the world had misjudged. "I see," he muttered. "We'll handle the bodies, and I'll have words with Cross." But they both knew Cross's power was finished. When the sheriff and his men rode away, the valley fell silent again. Not the silence of fear this time, but of peace. Tay turned to her. "The debt is paid," he said softly. "You are safe. If you wish us to leave, we will go." Ruby looked around at the cabin that had been her cage, at the mountains that had both guarded and imprisoned her. Then she met his gaze. "You came to ask for my hand," she said, her voice steady. "You never heard my answer." Tay waited, not moving, not breathing. A slow, genuine smile bloomed across her face, lighting her features like sunrise over the desert. "The answer is yes." The words hung in the quiet dawn like a promise written on the wind. No one in Redemption Gulch would have ever guessed it, not Wade Cross, not Eli Boone, and certainly not Ruby Lane herself. Her story, once defined by silence and survival, had shifted beneath her boots. The life ahead wouldn't be one of stillness behind cabin walls. It would be a life between worlds, part rooted in her father Hank Dobbs' rough-hewn homestead, and part carried by the heartbeat of the Chiricahua Plains. It would be strange, demanding wild, but it would be hers. She didn't leave that morning nor the next. There was work to be done, farewells to the valley that had shaped her, and quiet hours spent learning the ways of those who had come to protect her. But as she stood on her porch beside Tay, the Apache warrior who had come not to conquer, but to honor her bloodline, Ruby watched the sunrise burn across the Dragoon Mountains. The light touched her face, and for the first time in years she felt it wasn't only warming the earth, it was reaching her heart. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.